Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is American Negro slavery, the Civil War amendments, and human trafficking. And we are fortunate to have with us to talk about a whole series of efforts on the part of some people to keep people enslaved, as well as to use people in what is termed human trafficking, Alana McLaughlin. And of course, Alana will give us some information in reference to her background, her education, and some of the things that were important in terms of bringing her with us this morning. And we might also add, for those of our viewers who might not know you, Alana, that you've been with us on many, many occasions, and you've given us some excellent information in reference to a whole variety of issues. And today you've decided that you wanted to talk about slavery, the Civil War amendments, and human trafficking. But before we get into that, Alana, let's have you to give us some information about your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in terms of eventually bringing you to us and to have you to deal with this particular topic this morning.
Well, first of all, I want to start by saying good morning. And also, as you've already said, my name is Alana McLaughlin. I was born August 27th, 2002, born and raised right here in Nashville. I currently go to John Early Middle School. I'm going to sixth grade. Now, some interesting things about me and some of what kind of brought me here was, well, when I was growing up, I used to watch you kind of format your videos to be able to put on YouTube, and I started by crawling around your office, and then by the time I got to about the age of 6, I started tapping on like, I want to be on the show, put me on the show, I want to be on the show. And then by the age of 7, you finally let me on. And so that's kind of what so basically begging got me here. And so I've been doing the show ever since I'm 7, and I'm about to be 11. So now some things of me, like some activities I do. I am in the acolyte ministry at my church. I do it quite often, actually. I am on the debate team. Back in March, I won our championship as single ranked, me at like the top of everybody. And so I think that's pretty cool. And those are some of the activities I do outside of school. And I basically focus on work. And so it's just work. And I don't have a problem with it. And so that's how I live, and those are some things about me.
Very good. And so, Alana, you decided today to talk about a topic that I think we've had you to deal with on a number of occasions, but that is known as American Negro slavery. And I think you've mentioned to us earlier that slavery started in 1690 and ended in 1865. That was about 300 years. Let's talk about slavery within that context, leading up to what you would call the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Tell the audience this morning what you know about the institution of slavery from that perspective.
Slavery. When you hear that word, most of you think of Harriet Tubman, Underground Railroads, picking cotton and burning up in the hot sun. But it's much more than that. It's almost like a book almost, but every page is a new aspect. Slavery, it was all kinds of things. You could be a servant inside the house, or you could be the one picking cotton outside in the farm. Now, there were different types of slavery, and there were different types of slaves. Actually, interesting fact about slavery. Back in those days, if you were, say, like the color of the inside of my skin right here, so if you were like this color and up, you would be a servant. You would work inside the house. And if you were very, very dark, you would work outside in the field. So they had the light skinned and the more, say, pretty people working inside the house, and if you were darker, which they classified you as ugly, you had to work outside. And they basically did that because the more light-skinned you were, the closer you were to white. But you still weren't white, so you still had to be a slave, but at least you didn't have to work as hard as the people who they thought were ugly. And so that's the interesting fact about slavery. And when I say that there were different aspects of slavery, I mean there were different. Well, I say different. I mean there were all sorts of slavery. There were all sorts of labor, all sorts of torture. But in the end, slavery was slavery. there's no good slavery. There's only bad slavery.
Okay,
and
very
that's
good. And of course, Alana, I think that is essentially some of the information that we wanted to bring out in reference to this first part of the show for today, to get you a background, education, that kind of information, and to get you started and laying the foundation for the discussion of the end of slavery with the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's given us some information in reference to slavery and the civil rights movement, as well as the Civil War amendments themselves. And of course, Alana, before we left talking about slavery, you promised, we promised the audience that we would talk about slavery, the end of slavery, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution, and you would give us all of that information in preparation to talking about slavery and human trafficking during the final 10 minutes of this show. But let's talk about the Civil War amendments, the end of slavery in 1865, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment from your perspective.
Now, if you're just tuning in, I'm going to give you a short summary of the first segment. I talked about some of my activities in life. My name is Alana McLaughlin. I talked about me, and then I talked about slavery, and I also mentioned the fact that some of the more light-skinned African Americans would work inside the house, and some of the more dark-skinned ones that were classified as ugly had to work in the fields. Now, in this segment, this is talking about after the Civil War and fresh out of slavery, like everybody was free, basically, everybody. And so after slavery, it was still pretty hard for African Americans. I mean, because it didn't change the fact that they were still hated, that we were still hated because we were black. It didn't change the fact that people actually still kept slaves. Slavery was abolished, but slavery really never stopped. It's even going on to this day. African Americans, well, everywhere, even South Asia, Ukraine, everywhere, there is slaves. I'm talking about everywhere. And now they don't really call them slaves, they call them indentured servants. And they call it, and that's basically it. Slavery was abolished, but slavery never really stopped. Slavery will go on, and it will go on just like racism or bullying. It can never fully stop. I mean, we can prevent it in some areas, or we can prevent it, we can lower it, but it'll never really stop. I mean, because that's just how the world's gonna be. And so that's why I try to do what I can as a person, and I try to help who I can. I mean, I can't save the world. I mean, I'm 10. I can't even save the U.S. I can't even travel around the U.S. I'm 10. But I do what I can here in Nashville, and that's something that I do.
Well, in looking at the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, that is the amendment that gave the Africans its freedom, as well as the 14th citizenship. Why don't you give us some information in reference to some of the individuals that eventually helped to bring about freedom of the slave, Abraham Lincoln and some of the abolitionists, and that kind of information in reference to this?
The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Those are the amendments that kind of revolve around African Americans. The 13th Amendment, the right to be free. It said that there should be no slavery. Slavery is illegal. If you keep slaves, jail. That made us free. And the 14th Amendment, the right to be a citizen. It told us that we are a citizen. That means we can have jobs, we can have houses, we can have cars, we can buy phones, or run businesses because we are a citizen. And now the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, the right to state our opinion. And I think that's the most important. Well, I think the 14th one is the most important because that gives us the right to be a citizen. But I really think all of them are important because you can't really live the full life of an African American until you have those three unless you know them, because if those had never been established, then we would probably still be slaves. We would be picking cotton, cooking meals day after day after day, and get nothing for it. But because of those three amendments, we were basically we were reborn, we were given life. And so the 13th, 14th Amendment just basically, it makes a true African American. And I'm putting emphasis on American because it gave us the right to be a citizen.
Do you think that citizenship is important? You mentioned the fact that Africans receive citizenship. Why is citizenship important, and why would you say that citizenship is important?
Citizenship is important because it gives you the right to be a person. It basically tells you that you're not just a shadow, that you are important to the world, that you are a citizen. And that's why I think everybody deserves to be a citizen. And I don't see anything wrong with people not being citizens. I mean, because that's giving them life. That's giving them the chance to live a normal life as an African or American or anybody for that matter. And so that's why I think citizenship is important.
So that's the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the Citizenship Amendment. And you think that the whole discussion that we're having today in America about some folks wishing to be citizens and et cetera, you think that we ought to support their aspirations to be citizens of the United States of America?
Yes.
Why would you? What would you tell the folks your age in reference to why individuals ought to be citizens of the United States?
I think for kids my age, I would tell them that people deserve to be citizens because people deserve the rights that we have. I mean, they need to be treated like we should be treated. They need to be able to have jobs like we have jobs. Like they should be able to have the chance to do something like we're doing right now, being on a show, producing, working behind the scenes, doing all this. They should be able to have jobs and cars and pretty little pink houses and anything.
And so you think that the American Republic is large enough for the inclusion of a large number of individuals who up to this time might not be considered citizens, but they can add a great contribution to American society? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I also think bringing more citizens, like making more citizens in the U.S. would be a good thing because the more people you have, like the more NAACP members you could have, and the more they could be able to change the world into a better place. And so the more the merrier, really, because if you had a family and all of them wanted to grow up to be NAACP members, if they all joined the NAACP, what if they end up being the president and they ended up being the president of the U.S. and changing the world in great ways? That's why I think the more the merrier. And
so in a real sense, you stand in reference to the inclusion of a large number of other individuals as citizens, primarily because Africans, when they came out of slavery in 1865, were not citizens, but yet and still they were able to obtain their citizenship. Do you think that they've made any kind of the Africans have made any kind of contribution since they were citizens?
Yes, they have. We've made lots and lots and lots of contributions. We have an African American president. Like we have great African Americans who inspire people. Maya Angelou, Oprah, anybody. I mean, even us, because we're all doing great things for the world in small ways.
Very good. And of course, let us take the second commercial break, and we'll be back with you following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome to this last segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's given us some information in reference to slavery, the Civil War amendments, and human trafficking. And she's already given us quite a bit of information concerning the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution, as well as some statements in reference to slavery. And now I think it is time, Alana, for you to speak to this important issue of slavery and human trafficking, the difference between what you have considered to be slavery and human trafficking.
Okay, slavery and human trafficking. Human trafficking is almost like, okay, say slavery was a genre. Human trafficking would be a subgenre, the genre that was born out of a genre. Slavery, human trafficking is like an aspect of slavery. It's like slavery makes more aspects of slavery. There comes human trafficking and a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's talk about human trafficking. It's where, but the human trafficking, the difference between, there's a big difference. Slavery was mainly involved with African Americans. Human trafficking is more common with other races than African Americans. So now it happens, human trafficking happens everywhere. It happens in Asia or Europe or Canada, anywhere. And so basically, when you say human trafficking, it's it's the fact where you could be sold for exploitation, or you could be sold like a slave. And so it does all things that slavery did, but it's much more gruesome now that they have more now, because back then they had guns and whips and other methods of torture, but nowadays they have even more. So being trafficked is even more painful nowadays because they have more arts of torture, they have more kinds of guns, more kinds of whips, more kinds of everything.
And so in a real sense, what you're saying is that human trafficking, and I think you've identified it as being all over the world and et cetera, is the exploitation of people. Is that what you're saying? And I think you gave us at one time some information in reference to substance abuse and drugs and et cetera, that it is also a part of human trafficking and somehow keeps people involved, keeps them tied into terrible situations. Is that what we're saying?
Yes. Now, prostitution. When you're being trafficked, you could be forced to be a prostitute or a slave or anything. You could be basically anything. You could just be there to be tortured. And I think that's one of the main reasons that there are so much kidnapping nowadays and killing, because you have to be kidnapped to be turned into an indentured slave or a prostitute, because they have to pick you up from where you are and take you somewhere else and put you through all these horrible methods of torture. And that's basically human trafficking, where you're forced to do things that most people wouldn't make other people do, and you're forced to do horrible things.
And Lana, tell me, for the benefit of the audience as well, where do you get your information in reference to human trafficking, and why would you decide to deal with this particular topic? Where did your information come from, and why do you want to deal with this kind of information?
Well, see, I was on Wikipedia reading up about slavery, and then I also had books reading about slavery, and then in all those books and all those Wikipedia pages and all those internet pages, I saw one thing that really stood out. In big letters, it said human trafficking, and it always would reference human trafficking. And so I decided to click on human trafficking and see what this thing was, because I'd heard about it, but I didn't really think much of it because I didn't really know what it was about. And when I looked into it, I just thought, wow, people have to go through this, and most people don't even live to tell their story about it. Only some lucky people get to be able to live and tell their story about it, and sometimes those stories are even lost. So most people don't even know about human trafficking because it happens in the dark. Nobody goes around telling people about it. You don't see it, but it happens, and so that's why most people don't really know about it. And that's maybe why I don't know about it.
And so, in a real sense, that you are now on a campaign, and you've always been on a campaign against slavery and in favor of emancipation and et cetera, but you're now on a campaign in order to help people who might be caught up in human trafficking. What would you say about a typical person that might be caught up in human trafficking? Who is impacted by this? Females or males or what? Who?
Mainly females, but then there are also males. I mean, because I don't believe that it would only happen to females. So it happens to everybody, little girls, little boys, grown men, grown women. And so it's mainly, I think the biggest kind of population would be kids and teens, like I'd say 9 through 17. That's the biggest area in which, because that's when you're kind of growing up a little bit, and that's where they think that they were like, oh, let's steal her, let's traffic her or him. And so that's kind of the biggest population, and it happens to everybody. It's not just a certain race that it happens to, because it can't happen to one race and not happen to another. It happens to every race, African Americans, Caucasians, Asians, everybody.
And so now, Alana, you think that people ought to be more aware of this very, very fact of human trafficking, that as abolitionists opposed slavery at an earlier period, you think that people ought to be more aware. You said that you were not aware of it. You think that more information ought to be provided in schools and whatever in terms of the possibilities of human trafficking?
Now, in schools, I think there should be more books in the library about it, but I think they shouldn't really start feeding you information about that until like 6th grade and up, because that's kind of when you sort of matured. Yeah, like you're 11 and up or 10 and up. And like in elementary school, if you start feeding elementary school like a first grader that kind of information, that scars them for life. I mean, that gives them nightmares. That makes them scared to go outside because they think, oh, well, we're going to be kidnapped and trafficked. And there are really, really very dark aspects of it, and that's not really fit for like a first grader or a second grader and all. So once you get like to middle school, like late middle school, that's when you should probably start learning about it, because that's when you won't be as terrified of it. Now, I'm not saying you won't be terrified, but I mean, you might not, but you wouldn't be as terrified as a first grader would.
So you think that more information and more people ought to become involved in trying to help individuals?
Yes.
Sometimes you see people who've been kidnapped, and you see messages all over and et cetera. And so people ought to be more concerned about this as one aspect of our daily lives and our existence, et cetera,
Yes.
to help folks.
Because, I mean, I think that not older, but like 10 and up kids will kind of react to it more, because, I mean, if I react to it with a sad face, like if I'm not having nightmares about it and if I'm still involved in trying to stop it, then other kids could do that. I mean, because I'm a 5 foot, small, scrawny, no muscle little girl in middle school in 6th grade. And all these 8th graders with big muscles and on the softball team and all that, they could make campaigns about it and raise awareness for it. I mean, if I can, then they definitely can.
And you think that more ought to be done in reference to trying to help folks who get caught up in these kinds of situations?
Yes, because everybody deserves justice, and it's sad that most people don't know about this, so most people can't help.
But you're on a campaign now to deal with what you might call trafficking, and so you believe that all people should have an opportunity to break away from these kinds of situations that they find themselves in?
Everybody deserves a chance to get away from it. Everybody deserves a chance to be able to just be able to walk away from it. And I mean, just like substance abuse, everybody deserves a chance to be able to get help for it, and that's just it.
Very good. And of course, Alana, let me thank you by doing this last few seconds in reference to some of the things that you've talked about, and I think our audience really appreciates the information that you've given us in reference to slavery, human trafficking, and the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And of course, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you, and good morning. Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi and the implications for the Middle East. And we have to talk about the overthrow of the President of Egypt, Dr. Leonard Madu, who has been with us on a number of occasions and is still considered to be one of the foremost authorities in reference to the politics as well as some of the social developments in the Middle East. And of course, Dr. Madu, let me welcome you to the show this morning and let you know how delighted we are to have you here to deal with this special, timely story in reference to what is going on in Egypt. As a matter of fact, you've been with us on a number of occasions talking almost specifically about the president and the Muslim Brotherhood and et cetera. So let's start off by having you to simply give us some information in reference to where we find ourselves today dealing with Egypt.
Yeah, well, you know, last year, or let's say since 2011, when the Arab Spring, you know, started, Tunisia, you know, fired the first shot, you know, successfully. Then Yemen came in, you know, there was a stalemate, and the president was forced to step down, you know, through U.S. pressure. And then you have the Libyan, you know, problem. And then Syria is still, you know, embroiled in the same thing. There was some in Bahrain, you know, that was crushed, you know, with Saudi Arabia's help. Then, of course, with Egypt, you know, after a few weeks demonstration, you know, Mubarak, who was a long-time president, was overthrown. Then Morsi, you know, who is a Muslim Brotherhood candidate, became president last year. The first time Egypt had a civilian president. You know, the first president was Nasser, who was a military man. Sadat came in, he was a military man. Mubarak was a military man. So Morsi was really the first freely elected civilian president in Egypt. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, had always wanted power for a long time, since its founding by Hassan el-Banna, you know, in the 20s. So eventually, when it got power, it seems that it didn't know what to do with it. However, you know, they made a lot of mistakes. You know, when Morsi took over, he started behaving, he and the Brotherhood, as if they had a mandate, which actually they didn't have. You know, it was a close election. So you still had Mubarak holdouts, Christians who were scared and all that, opposing him from the beginning. So actually, they didn't do a good job in trying to carry the Egyptians along. First of all, the first mistake Morsi made was to remove the army chief, you know, Marshal Tantawi, who handed over power to him. An experienced politician would have kept Tantawi on as army chief, you know, close to him, so that he can have an insight into what the army was thinking. And you can understand it's not easy for the army to start saluting a civilian president after so long of, you know, being in charge themselves from behind. So Morsi should have kept Tantawi. So when he removed him, he left some bitterness within the army itself. They felt insulted. So they were looking for opportunity to, you know, get a pound of flesh. Secondly, Morsi started, you know, issuing decrees that were so bizarre, trying to, you know, take dictatorial powers himself, knowing fully well he succeeded somebody who was overthrown for that particular reason. Third, he promised to make, you know, a Christian vice president, but he didn't, you know, carry out that promise. And that alienated him from, you know, the Christian, you know, community that would have supported him, you know. So that was another big mistake. Fourth, he started sticking his nose into the Syrian problem. And the Egyptian army didn't want any part of what's happening in Syria now. Now, a lot of the Muslim Brotherhoods, their members are fighting against the government of President Assad. Because you remember in 1982, over 10,000 Muslim Brotherhood people were slaughtered in the city of Hama for opposing President Assad. So those are still fighting now, and out of sympathy, Morsi, you know, wanted to help them, and the Egyptian army does not want to get involved in that at all.
And so, Dr. Madu, so essentially what we're saying is that the president really didn't understand that much about what was going on in Egypt in a real sense, because the mistakes that you're saying that he made were simply the kind of mistakes that a person who was not aware of the army, not aware of the Christians, not aware of anything at all. And it appears that before this first commercial break, everything that he did was wrong. Is that what? And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Leonard Madu, and the topic is the presidency of Mohamed Morsi of Egypt, his overthrow, and some of the implications for the Middle East. And Dr. Madu, let's pick up where we left off before we had our first commercial break, and continue our discussion in reference to some of the problems that President Morsi created in a real sense, as you've indicated during the first segment, for himself in reference to his presidency.
And then, fifth, like I said before, his regime was a kind of catalyst for religious intolerance. Muslims fighting Christians, Christians fighting Muslims, and then the army wants stability, not chaos. And the Muslim Brotherhood were taunting Christians, and Christians start feeling that, hey, what happened in Iraq is going to happen to us. Because after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, almost all the Christians in Iraq have been driven away. When Saddam Hussein was there, Iraq was a strong secular state. He didn't tolerate any kind of religious disturbances. Now they've driven them out. So the Christians in Iraq felt that with the Muslim Brotherhood in power and the way they were behaving and what they were saying, it would be a matter of time before they are driven out of Egypt. And they were willing to stand up and fight for it. And the army knew there would be problem if there was instability in the country. The United States is not going to stand by and watch Christians being slaughtered in Egypt. Now it's going to cause them some, what is that? The army gets $1.5 billion from the United States every year. And so if Morsi's regime start going the way the US government does not like, then the army will lose that money. And they are not willing to lose that kind of money. Because the army itself is a corporation in Egypt. They run a whole lot of things, you see. So they started seeing that Morsi was moving the way they don't want. Now, Morsi wants to gradually build a theocratic state in Egypt.
Just like Iran or something.
Okay, just like Iran or Saudi Arabia, okay? Because the policy, the principles of Hassan al-Banna, who was the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, is an eventual theocratic state in Egypt, an Islamic state in Egypt. Now, there's a difference between an Islamic nation and an Islamic state, just like a Christian nation and a Christian state. Egypt is already an Islamic nation, just like Jordan, and Syria and all this. But they don't want Islamic state. An Islamic state is one that its laws and everything is governed by the Quran. The
Good.
Quran is the constitution, like you have in Iran now, and you have in Saudi Arabia. Now, the government of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt antagonized the other moderate, governments in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates. Now, Saudi Arabia being the center of Islam doesn't mind a theocratic state in Egypt, but not one under the Muslim Brotherhood, because they see the Muslim Brotherhood as a subversive organization that if they entrench themselves in Egypt, they will start plotting to overthrow the Saudi monarchy, okay, and impose a radical Islamic state, not a moderate one like we have in Saudi Arabia. Okay. So that's very important. So what happened? In order to create problems for Mohammed Morsi that will really make people start agitating, they withdrew money they normally gave Egypt to balance its budget. Saudi Arabia stopped, funding.
So this was a real source of support for the Egyptian
Absolutely.
government.
Oh, yes.
And now, all of a sudden,
Exactly.
So it really started with Saudi Arabia in a real sense. Is that what we're saying?
That's correct. Saudi Arabia stopped funding. They normally gave about 8 billion or so. Now they've said they will start giving the money again. Kuwait withdrew. United Arab Emirates withdrew. That's about $12 billion right there that they've said now they were going to give because of the new change in regime. So they were scared of the Muslim Brotherhood because for long, like I said, the Brotherhood had been seen in most Arab governments as a subversive engine, like, Syria, what happened before. And they have their tentacles everywhere. So that was what was, frightening to these moderate Arab governments. Like I said before, when Egypt, sneezes, there's cough in other Arab capitals. So what is happening in Cairo is of importance to these other neighboring states. So the Egyptian army, was not willing to have a theocratic state, an Islamic state in Egypt anytime soon. Because people are already getting scared. Investors weren't investing because they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, whether there's going to be riots or strikes or whatever. So they're keeping their money away. Tourists are scared because they've heard of, the Christian Muslim riots everywhere. So that's draining the economy. So that was taxing the patience of everybody in Egypt, apart from the Brotherhood themselves, who really knew what they wanted, is to gradually seize power in Egypt and become the sole political party, and there will be no more elections. If you want to participate, you're either a Muslim Brotherhood member or you're out, just like Iran. If you want to run for office now, you got to be, part of the Muslim ruling class. Otherwise, you won't be able to run. So Egyptians don't want that. They want a secular, democratic state, even though they're an Islamic nation, because the most important center of learning of Islam in the world is in Egypt, the Al-Azhar University in Cairo. So they have enough of that, but they do not want a government, that would ask women what to wear and what
the Quran in reference to all of their activities.
Exactly, because now what will happen if you have an Islamic state in Egypt? All the Christians are going to run away, period, because that will force them to follow that rule. Moreover, most of the businesses we call, Western style businesses, liquor stores and all this are run by Christians. All those will be shut down. That's what happened in Iraq. Okay, so that would be a big blow to the Egyptian economy. And the army was watching all this nervously. And if that kind of thing start happening, the United States and Britain and France, West Germany, all this will withdraw, their economic assistance to Egypt, as well as Saudi Arabia, because they will feel threatened themselves. That is what has happened. And then you throw in the Sunni Shiite, problem in the mix. Then you have a combustible, environment there.
And so the Egyptian president just created a lot of problems for himself, and now it's a situation where he's no longer there. And I guess when we come back during this final segment, we'll find out exactly what are the prospects in terms of getting out of the box that he has found himself in. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Leonard Madu, and the topic is the overthrow of President Morsi in Egypt and the implications for the countries throughout the Middle East. And Dr. Madu, let's pick up where we left off the last time. And as I think our audience understand, that the president really was unable, in a real sense, to pull all of the parts together in terms of keeping himself in power. And now the army is in a real situation. Would you say running the country? Is that where we stand now?
Well, the army might be running the country, you know, from